Welcome back to Britain's Deadly Decade, part two, with talking about Dr. David Kelly, Robin Cook, and we'll finish off with a summary. Remember, there has been a part one of this. Do please refer to that. Introducing Caroline Stevens now.
Welcome to a Stepping Stones to Awareness show. I'm Caroline Stevens, and today I'm interviewing John Brindley from Leicestershire, here live in the studios, and we're talking about the part two of a two-part series on the Deadly Decade. This time we're going to be focusing on Robin Cook and David Kelly. Welcome back, John, and thank you so much for travelling today.
Thank you for that introduction. Well, yes, as we said in part one, we had the death of John Smith and we had the emergence of New Labour, and Tony Blair in particular.
He benefited from the death of John Smith.
Yeah, indeed, and took Britain down a route which we would not otherwise have gone down, in my opinion, or not gone down as willingly, let's put it that way, to what eventually happened, which was the war in Iraq. And the background to that, I mean, you've got both sides of the Atlantic here at work at the same time. Just prior to the new century, we had an organisation called the Project for the New American Century, reporting. These were very, very influential people, some of whom took power alongside George W. Bush when he became president in 2000. The summary of what this actually was talking about and what it was highlighting was saying that for America to position itself most effectively in the world, they needed to effect a regime change in 7 countries in the Middle East. All of these countries are the same as the travel ban that
Trump imposed, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. So in other words, this has been going on for some time.
And this was Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon,
Iran, certainly. Afghanistan. So we've got this happening. George Bush takes power. These people from the project are involved in his administration.
Now, of course, we know that Bush and Blair were very good friends, weren't they?
Absolutely, yeah, they were. And there was a very important event happened in 2001, which the world will never ever forget. And again, it was foreshadowed a little bit by what the people from the Project for the New American Century had warned, because they had said that all these actions in the Middle East would take a great amount of time, but for America suffering its own Pearl Harbor. And come at 9/11, what were the words that George W. Bush said in describing 9/11 but our Pearl Harbor? So, you know, in a way, that tells you something that you need to know, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is all happening. As you say, the relationship between Blair and Bush is a very significant one, because although, you know, the British government was always saying, you know, we're doing everything to avoid war, it could still be avoided even at this last moment. You know, the weapons inspectors are doing, if they're allowed to do their work. If Saddam comes up and meets his obligations, you know, there's no need for war to happen. The talk between those two very, very influential people seems to have been ongoing for a long time, at least a year before, where Tony Blair gives his undertaking that, you know, we're with you, whatever course this is.
We're with a poodle.
Yeah, although I don't see Britain as being a poodle. I see Britain as being up there with America in the mission in the Middle East. But where Dr. David Kelly comes in is surrounding this strange document which became known as the Dodgy Dossier, which was September 2002.
Well, wasn't Blair trying to convince Parliament that there were weapons of mass destruction?
He was. And there was one person who was in the best position of all to know whether that was true or not, or exaggerated or not, and that was one David Kelly, because he was a man who worked for the Ministry of Defence. He was a UN weapons inspector, so therefore it was his job to know, you know, what the biological warfare capabilities of Iraq were.
Yeah.
And in his opinion, and his expert opinion, you know, we could all speculate, but he was an expert. he may have had some weapons, but nothing like what was stated in this dossier. I mean, this dossier extended it to that he could launch weapons and they could be on the British mainland and disrupting, our lives within 45 minutes. And David Kelly made an intervention. Now, this was not an intervention that was out of order,
Right.
because he was somebody who had been given brief by the Foreign Office to talk to journalists, and this is what he did. He spoke to a gentleman called Andrew Gilligan
Right.
from the BBC. He was defence correspondent with BBC Radio 4, and basically, what was said was that a senior official in charge of compiling the dossier had decided to insert this passage about the 45 minutes, despite the fact that this information only came from one, and that, albeit an unreliable source. So, in other words, David Kelly, who had access to intelligence information, was saying that the dossier was not fully representative of the intelligence information that was being given to the British government. It was being sexed up. Those were the words, weren't they? Now, in those sort of circumstances, and Andrew Gilligan was doing his job for the BBC. I mean, we hoped that they would give a fair representation of what was happening. But there was a huge furore. Literally, sparks flew immediately. And part of those sparks flying was that Dr. Kelly got hung out to dry. He was named as the mole who had spoken to Andrew Gilligan, which catapulted him into the national spotlight immediately. Now, he was then called to give evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. This was in July the 15th, 2003. And this was by no means an easy grilling. This was a real going over. He was being questioned on enormous stuff, weighty issues. His role in what had happened was under the microscope. And it would not have been an easy time for him. We must say that. But, the next day, he was speaking to another intelligence committee, apparently in good form. 2 days later, he was booking a flight to Iran, which I presume was not a holiday, but to do with his work. He was talking to friends about the fact that the worst of things was over, and he was in all intents and purposes in good spirits. That day, he was dead.
And what were the circumstances relating to the death?
Yeah, interesting circumstances. I mean, he was found collapsed in the woods near his home. So he'd apparently left his home. After booking this flight and doing some emails and acting in a completely normal way, he'd left his home, gone out into the woods. He had allegedly committed suicide, and the modus operandi of the suicide was to cut an artery in his hand,
Yeah.
and also to take some tablets. There was a blister of tablets. The evidence looked as though there were 30 tablets in total, and there's only half or one tablet left. So he must have taken the other 29. There was a bottle of water there, which indicated he might have used the water to dissolve the tablets, and he was slumped against the tree. Although there was different stories about how when people saw his body, exactly the circumstances of where he was, etc.
29 tablets is a lot to take.
Exactly, except the problem was there's no evidence that he took those tablets. He had taken a smaller amount of the tablet,
Yeah.
but when the toxicology did not suggest that he had taken those 30 tablets.
So they conducted an autopsy then?
Well, what happened was, and this is quite extraordinary really, because you'd imagine, wouldn't you, that the first thing that would happen when somebody had died in sort of circumstances like this, it's an unnatural death. Whatever has happened, it's an unnatural death. You would think that the first thing would happen would be an inquest, wouldn't you? Coroner gets to work, opens an inquest. Well, the coroner was already starting, but there was a certain man on a plane travelling between America and Japan by the name of Tony Blair, him again. And funnily enough, before he'd landed in Japan, he'd already reorganised things. And that was to arrange an inquiry, what was known as the Hutton inquiry. And so the coroner was packed up. You stop this particular issue. This is not for you. We're conducting an independent inquiry into the circumstances of Dr. Kelly's death.
Wow.
Exactly. That isn't really normal procedure. And there's great significance in the fact that it was the stage of inquiry actually was compared with it being an inquest. First of all, there was no necessity to call particular witnesses. They didn't have to go under oath. It was basically more an informal inquiry. And actually, Dr. Kelly was very much left out of his own inquiry because a lot of the evidence was surrounding the row between the BBC and the government and where the blame was for that. And Dr. Kelly was almost became incidental. There were issues raised within the inquiry which were, there was almost an element of humour in them, really. And you've got to remember that, with the circumstances that, there was no, they didn't have to call particular witnesses and they weren't under oath. So if we listen to what the pathologist said, Nicholas Hunt, in his evidence, he says, the features are quite typical, I would say, of self-inflicted injury if you ignore the other features of the case. Now that would sort of beg the question, well, what are the other features of the case? And please tell us more. But, these questions weren't followed up.
So they never did explain these are the features?
Lord Hutton became known as Lord Whitewash, basically, because, as we said, the death certificate was issued before the end of the inquiry. Key issues were never really dealt with. As I say, they centred more on the BBC and less on the circumstances. This is quite hilarious, actually. Obviously, Lord Hutton had a great trust in the media because he admitted in a press article 2 years later that the circumstances of Dr. Kelly's death had already been reported in the media reports, so it wasn't worth spending too much time on them. Well, I'm sure that's very reassuring, isn't it? No fingerprints on the water bottle that he was supposed to have used. No fingerprints on the knife. The fact that apparently he'd injured the arm that he used to cut himself, and he'd apparently injured that some months before and was struggling to use it to even cut a steak. So to use a steak knife.
Well, it was in the establishment's best interests that we were taken into war. And he was going to disprove that. Well,
what we're saying is, and the evidence supports this, is we were committed to it. And this man was an obstacle on the way. And the obstacle was got out of the way because he was highlighting what, we now know, or most of us probably believe, that there weren't this huge threat to British security within an hour we could all be dead. He was saying something that very much, went against what the government was doing.
So, has Dr. Kelly left behind a family?
Yeah, he has left behind a family. And here is another clue because at the very time of his death, his wife was ill, and his daughter was about to get married. Doesn't sound like the type
Somebody
of person
to commit suicide. No.
Let's also remember this man wasn't the office junior. He was a man who was, recognised as one of the foremost experts in biological warfare and defence, working for the United Nations. He dealt with everything. He was 59 years old. He'd been there and done it. This was his job. It would have been a great strain to undergo the grilling he'd had. Yeah. But the evidence was that he'd come to terms with it, and that he was in a sound mind. You might be interested, by the way, because one of the other types, the other groups of people that weren't called were Dr. Kelly's friends. People who actually knew him, people who might have been able to talk about his state of mind. One of them spoke to him 6 months before this occurred, and they asked him an interesting question. The question was, should Britain eventually go to war in Iraq, because obviously it was to be discussed a long time before, what do you think would happen to you? And his answer was, you'll probably find me in the woods one day.
That's where we ended up.
So just like Princess Diana with, you'll find me in a car accident, Dr. Kelly saying, you'll find me in the woods one day. Maybe we should actually start to listen to people, in their own cases. It was immensely suspicious, even if Dr. Kelly, the official version was true, and Dr. Kelly had committed suicide, then surely there should have been the most enormous investigation to find out why he'd been put under such intense pressure to have unsettled him in such a way. Do you see what I mean? Because because then the inference would have been that he committed suicide as a result of the circumstances in which he'd just been placed. Now, as I say,
does this link with the Chilcot report then?
Yes, it does really.
Because, as I recall, Jeremy Hayward, Chief of the Civil Service, kept suppressed that report for a long, long time.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been a bit of a whitewash as well, hasn't it?
I think there's links also between Chilcot and the government and Blair. He was a good choice for that particular work as well, and it took a very long time for him to report, didn't it?
It did.
It's always good, isn't it, when somebody independent though comes in and gives a view. And there's a guy who I think is a national hero actually in this one.
Who's that?
And his name's Norman Baker, and he at the time was a Liberal Democrat MP, a leading MP within the Liberal Democrat Party, and he actually took a year out of his life, political life, to investigate what he called the strange death of David Kelly. And as you see there, he actually produced a book about it, and a very good book it is as well. And his conclusions were very much of what we've been hinting at, that he said that the only conclusion that he could come to, having looked at all the evidence, was not suicide, not an accident, it had to be murder. He didn't point the finger, but he was saying it had to be murder. And he looked at the inquiry and tore it apart basically, for the reasons that we've just said, that it didn't really it didn't cover the issues that were paramount. The row between the BBC etc. is really secondary, isn't it, to the death of a very important man. So
it just shows that there are some good MPs.
Oh, absolutely.
If we just remove their party political allegiances to one side and just focus on the people who have done good for the people.
Yeah,
and that's what we need, isn't it? People in Parliament that support the people, not be covering things up. So papering over the cracks. So moving on now then to Robin Cook.
Yeah, moving on to, and of course...
Now, was that the guy that was on television all the time, it seemed to be?
Well, he was extremely prominent. After all, he was the Foreign Secretary, wasn't he, at one point?
That Robin Cook.
Yeah, that Robin Cook, yeah. And we're now really just a couple of years on, still covering the same story, aren't we? Because it's the Iraq War again. Now, if we looking at Robin Cook, he was the MP for Livingston from 1983 until his death, which was on August the 6th, 2005. When Tony Blair became Prime Minister, he took the job as Foreign Secretary, and he made a big point that he was going to add an ethical dimension to foreign policy, which is quite an undertaking, isn't it? Because it's a very hard, area to be ethical in. Now, he did come under scrutiny due to British interventions in Kosovo and Sierra Leone, where some people wondered, were they entirely ethical policies they were leading? But he also had some successes. One was ending the death threat against Salman Rushdie. He helped to resolve that. Do you remember, over the satanic verses?
Yes.
Yeah. And he helped to resolve an 8-year impasse over the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing as well. So Libya handing over 2 accused men in that particular issue. So he had his successes. And then he was removed from the job as Foreign
Too good for the
Secretary.
job.
Yeah, maybe so. And a man came in who was very much more a Blair man and very much more an establishment man, Jack Straw. Yeah, alarm bells actually when you hear his name.
He was a big supporter of open door immigration, I seem to recall.
Strangely enough, yeah.
And doesn't his son, is it Will Straw, wasn't he involved in the referendum to remain?
Yeah. Very much a Blair man. So at that particular point, Robin Cook, with all his experience, is made leader of the House of Commons, which he regarded as very much a demotion. Still an important role. But where Cook comes in, and why we're including this, is when he made his exit from the government. Yeah. Because the build up to the war in Iraq, or Tony Blair trying to railroad things through, despite a lot of Labour MPs at one point voting against him on motions. There was the previous advice where over the legality of the war. There was grey areas there, but one of the most damaging things that was done throughout this period was a fantastic speech by Robin Cook. When it was his resignation speech, and to be honest, I'd advise people to look it up on YouTube because it's absolutely brilliant. It's one of those broadcasts that must have been brilliant at the time to listen to, but when you listen to it, however many years later, it seems even more. It seems even more poignant. I mean, he made one of the most obvious points, which was, here you are saying, Saddam Hussein is very, very strong. He's got these weapons. We're in mortal danger, and yet we're going to go into Iraq and we can resolve this so quickly. So you're saying at the same time he's weak and he's strong. You can't have both those. If he was
so started questioning.
Yeah, I mean, if he was so strong, we wouldn't have done it, would we? We would have been there would have been a grave danger in going into Iraq. So Robin Cook's speech, it won sort of like a lot of acclaim at the time. There's a huge ovation from both sides of the chamber, which doesn't happen very often, does it?
No.
And so he stepped down from the government, and he continued to be active, mostly in journalism, in fact. And I'd like to sort of point out something that he spoke about, which was only a few months before he died, and that was he wrote an article in The Guardian, in which he described Al-Qaeda, which was obviously mentioned a lot during this particular time as being part of the enemy, the war on terror. Al-Qaeda was a product of Western intelligence, and I'll just read his words, precise words, because they're important. He says, Bin Laden was, though, a product of a monumental miscalculation by Western security agencies. Throughout the 80s, he was armed by the CIA and funded by the Saudis again, to wage jihad against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, literally the database, not something that was going to cause us mortal problems, but a database, was originally the computer file of the thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with help from the CIA to defeat the Russians. Now that was pretty devastating stuff. He's pouring down on the bogeymen, Bin Laden, Al Qaeda. What was our role with Bin Laden before these times? What is the danger from Al Qaeda? I mean, Al Qaeda was supposedly the organisation behind 9/11. Well, no evidence, though, was there?
No.
So, in other words, he was again an obstacle. And what happened is, here's the official story. He and his wife were on a 2-week holiday in the Highlands of Scotland. Apparently these mountain walkers, they have some very dangerous times. He was walking down Ben Stack when he suddenly suffered a severe heart attack, and he fell and lost consciousness. Paramedics arrived. It always takes a while, doesn't it, when they don't want somebody to survive. And he was dead by the time he got to hospital, by the way. So there was no chance for him. Now, the official version is he died of hypertensive heart disease. This was
he was a fit man.
Yeah, exactly. He was 59 years old. He was believed to be in good health. I mean, obviously, I'm not foolish and suggest that such a thing can't happen. Of course, we know it can, but did it, or was it induced in some way? Let's put it this way: it was very convenient that Robin Cook
the obstacle was removed.
Yeah, because again, when we've been speaking about these important people, who did die in suspicious circumstances, it's not just about what they'd achieved and what they'd said in their lifetime. It's what would have happened if they'd lived longer.
They weren't yes people. They questioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Big establishment decisions.
What would Robin Cook have been writing about next? How much of a thorn in the government side could he have been? How much of a thorn in the establishment side could Diana have been in the future?
Mm-hmm.
So we are dealing with these issues with the fact that ordinary people often are unaware that the powers that be can think ahead, and they know what's going to happen, and they've got a good idea what's going to happen. If John Smith had lived and had won the 1997 general election, we may never have been in Iraq. Who knows? I mean, I'm speculating to a certain extent, but we would certainly not have been issuing dossiers saying that Saddam Hussein
dodgy dossiers.
Exactly. Dr. Kelly would not have needed to speak out in such a way, because that document would never have been signed. It would have been much more, you'd have expected it to be much more accurate and fair-minded. So one event goes on to another. There's a knock-on domino effect. At the time, we view them as isolated incidents. In the
when you're joining the dots.
Yeah.
So I mean, over this 2-part series, we've looked at Jill Dando, Princess Diana, John Smith, who was the leader of the Labour Party, Robin Cook, and Dr. David Kelly.
Yes.
And who will be in the future. So, to sum up, all these 5 deaths, which have fitted in nicely for the establishment.
Yes.
What do you see happening now?
Well, the reason we talk about things such as this is not to entertain ourselves or to make ourselves fearful, but to be knowledgeable and to be aware of what's going on. It's foolish of us to think that that was the last that was the last intervention there would be. I have a lot of worries about the conviction of Thomas Mayer regarding the murder of Joe Cox.
Joe Cox.
Yeah, that to me looks like another Barry George.
Yeah.
And Richard Hall again has done an investigation that asks all sorts of questions about that particular trial.
Yeah.
So we must be aware that this can still happen, and if we do not remember the past and we do not try to come to terms with the past and to heal the past, we can go through the same thing again.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Blair's name has cropped up so many times.
Yeah.
And we see him wheeled out before the referendum.
Yeah.
Why is it persistently that the media supports people who appear not to have our best interests at heart?
Well, the media is very much in that, as we're talking mostly obviously about the mainstream media, are we not? Are very much in the hands of the establishment. Yeah. I mean, you could have mavericks working for the BBC, But if they start digging too much, I mean, what happened to Andrew Gilligan? Did the BBC say thank you very much for that fantastic story? No, they didn't. He resigned, and that was then. It's worse now. Greg Dyke, instead of defending himself and saying, well, we were here with the best interests of Britain at heart to reporting this, he resigned. Director General of the BBC. People who stick their necks out can
get their heads chopped off.
They can do, and also, people will not speak out if they fear that their jobs are at stake.
Yeah.
And you can be the best. You can be the best journalist in the world working for the BBC, but if you're not going to have a job, come the end of your report, were you really going to do that? So
I think we're seeing as well in today's society that more and more people are feeling aggrieved by the lack of justice.
Oh, absolutely, in all respects.
And whitewashes,
Yeah.
Cases going to Crown Prosecution Service
Yeah.
and being dropped,
Yeah.
and basically corruption throughout the judiciary, police, and Parliament.
Absolutely.
So on that note, to wrap it up, have you got a message for the people listening at home?
Yeah, my message to the people listening at home is to do your own research.
Yeah.
Not to believe everything that is presented to you. So when you hear about the incidents in Salisbury, keep an open mind.
Yeah.
Keep a mind saying, well, is it are we being presented with a version of events that suits a particular agenda? What do we actually know that's gone on, rather than what we've been told as fact? And we've got to. But I do see positives, and the positives are that people generally are waking up more quickly now than before. I don't think, for instance, there will ever be an event like 9/11 tried again. I don't believe that that the death of Diana could be repeated again, because it won't take a few years for people to question it. It'll take a few minutes.
And you mentioned that Jill Dando's fiance he delivered Kate Middleton's baby.
Yeah, he's the gynecologist of the Queen. There's a reward. I said there's a penalty for people who tell the truth and speak out and put their necks out there. There's also a reward for those who toe the line, and that reward is often promotion and sort of a higher position. And he's got to live with that, I think. That's really what I wanted to say about that.
Well, thank you, John, for coming into the studios.
Thank you.
We've had a really enjoyable 2-part series, and I'd like to say thank you to the viewers at home. I've learnt a lot over the last few hours, and I hope you have too. And perhaps do your own research and drop a line to the show. Look forward to seeing you again on another Stepping Stones to Awareness interview. I'm Caroline Stevens. I was with John Brindley today, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.
And if you want to get a little bit more from Caroline, she's got a page on the basisproject.org website. If you want to help the situation move along smoothly, do donate to Miles at the basisproject.org. We'll be setting up other means of helping Stepping Stones to Awareness shortly. Thank you and good night.